Most people think they're not doing enough. They think they need to train harder, optimize more, or push farther. But what if the real problem isn't that you're undertraining? What if the real problem is that your body can no longer recover from what you're already doing? Because at some point, the issue is no longer effort, it's capacity. Capacity to absorb stress, to repair, to return to baseline. And when that capacity begins to decline, something subtle starts to happen. You can still push, you can still show up, you can still do all the work, but the system no longer responds the way it used to. And over time, that mismatch between what you demand and what your biology can recover from, that's where dysfunction begins. So in our lab, we've started to think about aging a little bit differently, not simply as the accumulation of damage, but as a progressive loss of something much more fundamental, the loss of dynamic resilience, or the loss of the ability to recover from disruption. And once you start to see aging through that lens, everything changes. Because now the question is no longer, how much can I do? The question becomes, how well can I recover from what I do? Welcome to the ReProgram. And remember, knowledge is power. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ReProgram podcast. I'm your host, Dr. George Murphy. And as I mentioned, in our lab, we've started to think about aging a little bit differently, not simply as the accumulation of damage, but as a progressive loss of something we refer to as dynamic resilience. So the loss of your ability to recover from disruption. And that framing turns out to be incredibly important, because once you start to begin to understand aging in that way, you start to see that many of the challenges people experience, whether it's declining performance, increasing fatigue, or loss of function, these are simply not the result of doing less. They often are the result of a reduced capacity to recover from what we're asking the body to do. And that brings us to what I think is one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern health and performance: recovery. So what is recovery actually? Because I think this is where a lot of the confusion begins. So most people think of recovery as rest, as taking time off, as doing less, as the absence of effort. But biologically, that's not what recovery is. So recovery is not passive. Recovery is active. It's a highly coordinated biological process through which the body responds to stress. It is how the body restores homeostasis. It's how it repairs structural damage. It's how it recalibrates signaling systems. And ultimately, it's how it turns stress into adaptation. Because without recovery, stress doesn't make you stronger. It definitely doesn't make you more resilient. It simply accumulates. And over time, that accumulation begins to degrade the system. So the key idea here is this: recovery is the process that determines whether stress becomes adaptation or becomes damage. And that distinction is critical because, really interestingly, two people can apply the exact same stimulus, the same workout, the same stress, the same demand, and have completely different outcomes. One maybe adapts, the other breaks down. Not because the stimulus was different, but because the capacity to recover from that stimulus was different. And this is where the conversation begins to shift. Because if recovery is the process that governs adaptation, then recovery is not optional. It's fundamental. It's the mechanism through which the body maintains itself, repairs itself, and preserves function over time. So if we step back and simplify this, adaptation really comes down to two things: the stimulus, of course, and then your capacity to recover from that stimulus. And what most people focus on is the first part. They focus on the workout, the intensity, the volume, the protocol they're using. They focus on what they're doing, but the body doesn't adapt to what you do. it adapts to what it can recover from. And that's a very different concept because it means that the exact same input can produce different outcomes depending on the state of the system receiving it. So when we think about adaptation, we can think about it like this. There's the stress you apply, and there's the capacity you have to absorb and respond to that stress. And when those two things are aligned, the system adapts. It becomes stronger, more resilient, more capable. But when they become mismatched, that's when problems begin. If the stimulus is too low relative to your capacity, then maybe there's no signal, no reason for the system to change. But if the stimulus exceeds your capacity to recover, then the signal becomes noise and the cost begins to outweigh any benefit. And this is where I think a lot of people get stuck because they assume that if they're not progressing, they need more stimulus, more effort, more intensity, and more work. But very often, that's not the case. The issue is that the system no longer has the capacity to recover from what's already being asked of it. And once that happens, adding more stress doesn't solve the problem. It actually amplifies it. And this is a lesson I've had to learn personally because, like many people, I've always trained. Resistance training has been a constant for me. And if you asked me earlier in my life what mattered most, I would have told you it's the sets, it's the reps, it's the load, and it's the intensity. I was focused on the stimulus, on doing enough, on pushing the system hard enough to force adaptation. But over time, something started to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually and quietly. The response began to shift. I could still train, I could still push, but I wasn't recovering the same way. The same workouts didn't produce that same adaptation. The same effort didn't yield the same return. And that's when my realization began to shift, that the problem wasn't that I wasn't doing enough. It was that I was no longer recovering from what I was doing. And once you see that, you really do start to approach things very differently because now the goal is no longer to maximize the stimulus. The goal is to align the stimulus with your capacity to recover from it. And for many people, that means doing something that feels very counterintuitive. It means doing less. It means reducing volume, reducing intensity, creating more space between hard efforts, actually allowing the system time to recover from the stress that's being applied. Because if you're training hard and you're not seeing the results you expect, if you're pushing but not progressing, if you're accumulating fatigue without that adaptation, then the answer is not always more. In many cases, the answer is better recovery, more recovery days, more intentional spacing of stress, less constant high intensity input, because what the system needs in that moment isn't more challenge. It's more capacity to respond to the challenge that's already there. And that shift from asking how much more can I do to asking how well am I recovering from what I'm already doing, that's where the real progress begins. Okay, so this is where we need to zoom out a little bit because this isn't about individual choices. It's about the environment we're operating in because modern life in many ways is perfectly designed to disrupt recovery. We live in a world that continuously applies stress, but rarely allows that stress to fully resolve. There's constant cognitive load, constant stimulation, constant input. We move from one demand to the next without ever truly returning to baseline. And biologically, that really matters because recovery requires resolution. It requires a shift out of a stress dominant state into a state where the body can actually repair and recalibrate. And for many people, that shift never fully happens. Even when they're not actively working, the system's still engaged, still stimulated, still processing. And over time, that creates kind of a background load, a persistent signal that never fully turns off. And layered on top of that, we see other factors that further degrade recovery capacity. Sleep becomes fragmented, not just shorter, but less restorative. Metabolic inputs become unstable. Blood sugar fluctuates. We have inconsistent fueling, periods of under recovery from a nutritional standpoint. And in some cases, even well intentioned interventions, things like aggressive calorie restriction or maybe appetite suppression, these things can further reduce the resources required for this recovery. And then we add training on top of that, often high intensity, often frequent, often without sufficient spacing. So what we end up with is a system that's being asked to perform in the absence of the conditions required to recover. And that's an important distinction because it's not that people aren't trying. It's that the system they're operating within makes recovery incomplete, not absent, but insufficient. And over time, that insufficiency accumulates. And when it does, the system begins to change. It becomes more conservative, more protective, less willing to invest in that adaptation we're looking for. Because from a biological standpoint, the environment no longer supports it. And this is why simply adding more input, more training, more optimization, more interventions, often this doesn't solve the problem because the limiting factor is no longer effort. It's recovery capacity within the context of our environment. Okay, so what does this actually look like? What does it look like when the system is no longer adapting because it no longer has this capacity to recover? So it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like sudden collapse. It's subtle. It looks like drift. You're still training, but maybe you stop progressing. You're still putting in that effort, but the returns begin to diminish. Workouts that used to feel productive start to feel depleting. Fatigue begins to accumulate, not after just one session, but across days. Sleep becomes less restorative, even when you're getting enough of it. You wake up feeling not fully recovered, and over time, you begin to notice something else. Maybe small injuries, nagging discomfort, things that don't quite resolve the way they used to. And alongside that, there's often a shift in how the system feels overall. Energy becomes less stable, mood becomes variable, cognitive clarity begins to fluctuate. And importantly, the capacity to tolerate stress, physical or otherwise, begins to narrow. Things that once felt manageable now feel more taxing. And this is where the interpretation often goes wrong because people assume I must not be doing enough. I need to push harder. I need to increase the stimulus. But what's actually happening is quite the opposite. The system is not under challenge, it is under recovered. And when a system is under recovered, adding more stress does not restore function. It actually accelerates the decline. So what you begin to see is a pattern: more effort, less adaptation, more input, but less return. And that pattern is one of the clearest signals that recovery capacity has become the limiting factor. And now this brings us to something I think is really important because recovery is not just a process, it's also a signal. So just like resistance training sends a signal that a function is required, that strength matters, that the system needs to maintain its capacity, recovery sends a very different kind of signal. It tells the body that repair is supported, that resources are available, that the environment is stable enough to invest in rebuilding. Because from a biological perspective, adaptation is an investment. It requires energy. It requires resources. It requires the system to commit to maintaining and improving function. And the body will only make that investment if the conditions support it. So when recovery is present, when sleep is sufficient, when metabolic inputs are stable, when there is adequate spacing between stressors, the signal the body receives is it's safe to repair. It's safe to build. It's safe to maintain function. And in that environment, the system responds. It restores itself. It adapts. It preserves capacity over time. But when recovery is inconsistent or incomplete, that signal changes. Now the system becomes much more conservative, more protective, less willing to invest in that adaptation because, from its perspective, resources are limited, stress is ongoing, and the priority shifts from growth to survival. And this is a critical distinction because at that point, the system is no longer optimizing for performance, it's optimizing for protection. And when that shift happens, you can continue to apply stimulus, you can continue to push, but the response you're looking for will not occur because the underlying signal is no longer aligned with that adaptation. Okay, so what do we do with all of this? Because the goal is not to eliminate stress. Stress is actually necessary. Stress is the input, it's the signal that drives this adaptation. But the goal is to restore the system's ability to recover from that stress. And that begins with alignment between what we're asking the body to do and what your body can currently support. And for many people, that may mean actually stepping back, not as a sign of weakness, but as a strategy. It means recognizing that more is not always better, and that in many cases, the most effective way to move forward is to create the conditions that allow the system to respond. So that may mean reducing volume or reducing intensity, maybe spacing out high demand efforts, allowing recovery processes to fully resolve before you apply that next stressor. It may mean pay closer attention to the foundational inputs that we are all very familiar with, things like sleep, nutrition, energy availability, and the overall load that the system is carrying, because all of these things contribute to recovery capacity. But more than anything, it requires a shift in how you think about progress, because progress is not simply about doing more. It's about responding more effectively to what you do. And that's a very different model. It's a model that prioritizes this sustainability. It prioritizes function over time. It prioritizes the ability to return to baseline again and again, because that's what resilience actually is. Not the ability to endure unlimited stress, but the ability to recover from it. And when you begin to train and live with that understanding, everything starts to change, because now you're no longer chasing maximal input. You're building a system that can adapt, a system that can repair, a system that can preserve function over time. And ultimately, that's what allows the body to maintain itself as it ages. So, aging is not just the passage of time, it's the gradual loss of the ability to recover from disruption. And the goal is not to eliminate stress, it's not to avoid challenge, it's not to remove the very signals that drive adaptation. The goal is to preserve the system's ability to respond to those signals, to absorb them, to recover from them, and to return to a state where function can be maintained and maybe even improved. Because when that capacity is intact, the body remains dynamic, it remains adaptable, it remains capable of responding to the demands placed upon it. Because when that capacity begins to decline, the system becomes more fragile, more limited, less able to tolerate the very inputs that once made it stronger. And so the focus has to shift from doing more to becoming a system that can respond more effectively, from maximizing output to preserving adaptability, from pushing the system to better understanding it. Because ultimately, longevity is not simply about extending time, it's about preserving function within that time. And function depends on resilience, the ability to recover again and again across years and decades. And when you begin to think about your training, your health, and your biology through that lens, you start to make different decisions, more thoughtful decisions, more sustainable decisions, decisions that are not just about today, but about who you want to be and how you want to function years from now. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion, and please follow the podcast and join me on this journey of understanding and self-discovery as we navigate our way through the fields of longevity, aging biology, regenerative medicine, and the emerging field of geroscience.